Usually it's a love-hate relationship when we have reading, and a lot of times it exists because either it's very easy for someone or it's very hard for someone. But you know what? God has made each one of us unique and as individuals, and He's made each of our brains. And He gives us different strengths and different possibilities. He also forms our personalities, and He has made us all in the same image. You know, as I have, over the course of my 37 years in education, as I have worked with students who have either excelled in reading or struggled in reading, then I hear them say, especially if they struggle in reading, I'm dumb. Just like we heard John talk about with Dr. Ben Carson. I'm dumb, I'm stupid, I can't do this, I can't figure it out. God doesn't make dumb. He makes us all beautiful, and He makes us all in His glory, and He makes us all in His image. And let me share some verses with you. Genesis 1:27 says, "So God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him. Male and female, He created them." Do you see anywhere in that verse that it says He creates us less? Less than equal? Less than unique and less than strong? Less than like Him? No. And so that's what I do when I'm working with students who struggle, is the very first thing I'm trying to get them to understand is that they are God's unique creation, and He loves them no matter how their brain is created and no matter what they struggle with. The second verse says, Psalm 139:14, "I praise You, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are Your works. My soul knows it very well." God doesn't make mistakes. He makes us all in His own image and in the way that He intends for us to be, and that includes our brains as well. I want to share with you the definition of reading. This is from Merriam-Webster, and if you actually look in the dictionary, there are 15 entries of what the definition of reading is. 15 entries, that's a lot. And we have to think about, when we're looking at the definition of reading, it really depends on the purpose that you have with reading, the task, the event, as to what definition you might choose, that you might use when you're looking at the definition of reading. We're going to look at number 1 and number 3 specifically today. Number 1, to receive or take in the sense of letters, symbols, etc., especially by sight or touch. And then to utter aloud the printed or written words of, like, read them a story. So we're going to be looking at that. Again, people approach reading differently, taking in the sense of those letters, those symbols at different levels. So let's go back to the Bible verses. God created our brains so uniquely and with a purpose. None of us are the same. We don't approach things the same. We definitely do not approach reading the same, even though God created us all in His own image. And isn't it good that we're not all the same? Isn't that a good thing?
I wouldn't want to marry me.
All right, I'm sorry my picture's a little bit grainy, but it's such a great illustration of what I wanted you to see about the brain. This is actually a picture of the reading brain. It can be likened to a real-time collaborative effort of a symphony orchestra. Think about each section in a symphony orchestra. Each of the section of instruments are unique and different. They're all played differently, they sound differently, but when you put them together and they're orchestrated together, they make such beautiful music. And it's the same with our reading brain. The brain works together like the sections of instruments to maximize our ability to decode the written text in front of us. And so the brain actually doesn't have a specific part that's used for reading. There's not one specific part that's used for reading. Instead, reading engages in different regions of the brain, like with multiple processes in our brain. And we're going to talk about those through these different parts that you see on the screen today. Thanks to brain imaging that we have available to us today, we can actually see pictures of brain activity when someone is reading and how that brain activity happens and how it lightens up the brain. And so we're going to look at the pictures that we have up here so that I can explain those parts to you. An experienced reader, a good reader, uses the left hemisphere of the brain for reading. That's the part of the brain that's used as we engage in reading if we're an experienced, good reader. So looking at the temporal lobe, which is here the back area of the left hemisphere. It's responsible for phonological awareness, decoding, and discriminating sounds. The occipital temporal, which is towards the very, very back of the temporal lobe, that helps us to be more fluent in our reading, and it stores images and meanings of words. It helps us to just be able to recognize quickly the letters and the sounds and the meaning of words, like sight words. We don't have to think about it, it just happens. We just know what they are. All right? And then the parietal temporal region, which is in front of the occipital, but still towards the back of the temporal, it helps us to break words into sounds. It gives us those sounds that we're looking for. The frontal lobe, at the very front part of the left hemisphere, handles speech production and reading fluency, as well as grammatical usage and that wonderful thing we call comprehension. That's where comprehension happens. And so it makes it possible for us to understand simple and complex grammar. It helps us to create those speech sounds that we need when we're sounding out words or we're looking at the words and thinking about how those sounds go together. It helps us to pronounce the words. And then the angular gyrus, or the supramarginal gyrus that it's sometimes called, is more like a reading integrator. It's like a conductor of sorts. It links those different parts together so that we can read successfully. It is our connector so that it can take what we see when we see the letters C, A, and T. It helps us to know that they say k, a, t, and then it helps us to put them together to say that word cat. So you can see that all the different areas of the brain work together to help us to be a successful reader. And again, I want to note one more time that an experienced good reader uses that left hemisphere of the brain. So let's think about the messages that you receive on a daily basis. What kind of messages do you receive? Text?
Road signs.
Road signs. We call that environmental print, believe it or not.
Body language.
Body language. We have to read body language, don't we? Yeah. How about social media posts? Do you still receive snail mail sometimes, especially from creditors, bills? Yeah. All right. So we have so much print coming at us and messages coming at us daily, even hourly, all the time. And so we have to discriminate what each one of those are for and for what purpose. That's going to help us to approach how we attack that reading differently. So, what are the purposes of reading? When I began to work on this presentation, I put it all together, and then John sent me the flyer to let me see what the flyer looked like. And do I need to do something?
He's trying to fix the static.
Oh, okay, just keep going. All right. And so it's funny, I thought, wow, does he have a little bird sitting in my living room as I'm preparing this presentation? Because if you read the summary that he had on the flyer about the book that he recommends, How to Read a Book by Mortimer J. Adler and Charles Van Doren, I thought, ooh, he listened in on what I was doing with my presentation because it mirrors what that book talks about very closely. I have not read the book, but I will be reading the book now that it's been recommended, but it follows so closely with what I'm talking about today and with the purposes of reading. For this presentation, I focus on and I believe in 3 purposes of reading. When you research about reading, you will find that some people say there are 6 purposes, 4 purposes, 2 purposes, many different numbers of purposes. But for the purpose of this presentation and for my philosophy, as well as the book that John recommended, there are 3 purposes of reading, and we're going to be talking about those 3 purposes today. And the 3 purposes that we're going to be looking at are reading to learn, reading for entertainment, and then reading to understand something better and or to communicate with others. Now we're going to attack each one a little differently, but there are similarities to the way that we are going to react in all three of those purposes, and we'll talk about that as well. The first thing we have to consider, though, are the types of reading within the purposes. We need to think about the genre. Are we looking at nonfiction? Are we looking at fiction? Are we looking at poetry? What kind of genre are we talking about when we're looking at the purposes of reading? And then what are the selections? There are so many selections that we already talked about. Environmental print, brochures, newspapers, magazines, novels, all kinds of things, emails, text messages. So the things that we read go on and on and on. And body language. We also read body language as well. So let's start out with reading to learn. We're going to look at each one of the purposes separately, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some other areas of where people struggle. So looking at reading to learn. What considerations do we need to think about when we read to learn? Well, are we going to be listening to the story, or are we going to be actively reading that story ourselves? Is it going to be a paper version, or is it going to be on the screen? Are we going to have one source that we're looking at to learn something, or will we be working with multiple sources? Because as you know, when we read to learn, a lot of times we're working with multiple sources. And then what is my learning style as I am going to attack this reading to learn? Do I like to have highlight or low light? Personally, I'm a highlight person. I like a lot of light when I'm studying something to learn. Do I want to sit at a desk or a table? Or do I want to sit on the couch or lounge when I'm reading to learn? Do I want soft music playing in the background, or do I want it to be starkly quiet? We all have our own ways that we read and our own styles of when we learn. And so those are some of the things that we need to consider when we are reading to learn. And then, am I going to take notes? Do I need to have a note-taking strategy? There's all kinds of ways to take notes, and we're going to start with Cornell notes. I don't know if you've ever heard of Cornell notes, but it is widely used in universities and in high schools across America. It's a very successful note-taking strategy, but some people like it and some people hate it. So when you look at the Cornell notes, it was actually developed by a Cornell education professor named Walter Pock. And he was writing a book on effective note-taking. His book is called How to Study in College. Imagine that it would contain how to take notes. All right, so as you can see, it's an upside-down T. And typically, people who use Cornell notes, they use it with a journal or a notebook, or they use those larger sticky notes, if you know what I'm talking about, the larger sticky notes so that they have room to write. And it's an upside down T, and on the left side of the upside down T are the cues, which are the questions. As I'm reading, what questions do I have? What comes to mind as I'm reading through the text? And then on the right side are notes, any facts that I might want to make sure I am aware of or that I remember. And then at the bottom is the summary. Summarize what I have learned and what I have talked about. Anybody use Cornell notes or know of Cornell notes? Okay, all right. Well, the next one is sticky notes. I use this one frequently when I am using or working with a text that I do not own. So if I've checked it out of the library or I've borrowed it from a friend, I'm going to use sticky notes. I love that I can put them right where my questions are or right where I'm working so that I can remember what I'm doing, all right? And then the next one is marginal notes. I bet a lot of you use marginal notes. Writing all in that text, if you own that text, if it's yours, writing messages inside the margins or your questions inside the margins, very successful. All right, and then the next one is the one that I probably use the most, highlighting or underlining. So I teach at my church the middle school and high school Sunday school class, and when I am studying, I am highlighting or underlining. And as I work through my study, I might be on the couch. That's where I do a lot of my Sunday school studying, or, believe it or not, on the exercise bike. I ride the exercise bike every morning for an hour, and I have a little book stand, so I'm able to study, either read for pleasure, which we're going to get to, or read to learn. And a lot of times I'll be studying my Sunday school lesson while I'm on the exercise bike. And so whether I highlight or underline, it really depends on my arm. Which one, can I reach the highlighter or can I reach the pen? It doesn't matter to me. Both are effective to me, and both work well. So it really just depends on what tool you have near you. And then a combination. And you'll find that if you looked at my Sunday school lessons, you would see that I highlight and underline a lot, but then I jot marginal notes as well. Things I want to make sure that I cover with the students, things that I want to make sure that I might say or talk about. And so I use a combination. How many of you are combo note people? It works successfully. It's pretty good at that, yes. And then this is not a comprehensive list. I'm sure that there are other strategies that you can use and that some of you may use. Perhaps you write in that notebook or that journal instead of write in the text. Some other considerations that you need to think about when you're reading to learn is, oh wait, what did that section say? I need to reread. There are a lot of times when I have to reread sections or pieces so that I can make sure that I understand what is happening in that text, especially when I'm reading and studying scripture for my Sunday school lesson or for my quiet reading time, my personal reading time. So sometimes I need to get clarification. Where do I go to get that clarification? I read and I reread and I still do not understand. So I go and seek out clarification. It might be online. It might be the phone where I call a colleague and say, hey, I just read about this and it's not clear, I need some help. So we also have to ask questions. We do that when we're reading to learn. So when we learn differently, when we read to learn, it also depends if we're going to just read to learn for ourselves or if we're going to share that learning with someone. I'm sure you would attack a text differently if you're just reading it for yourself to learn, or if you knew that you were going to be having to share that with someone in some type of format. All right, reading to be entertained, my favorite kind. When I was growing up, I lived in a house with a single mom, and I had 3 sisters. So there were 5 ladies in that household, and we had to compete for every single amount of time we got with anything. But my mother would be so angry with me because she would always say, Teresa, get your nose out of that book. You need to be washing the dishes, or you need to be doing the laundry. There she is, lost in that book again. I couldn't help it because we were a family of lower socioeconomic status and a single parent home. My mom was a school bus driver, and she drove a school bus for over 35 years. And she did a great job making sure that we had everything that we needed. It might not have been designer labels, but we had everything we needed. And so we had the opportunity to have access to a lot of used books. People would give us used books, and my nose was always in those books. And I was always lost in those books because I might not could travel with my family to Big Bend National Park or to Israel or anywhere else, but I could travel in those books. It was so much fun to travel and get lost in the books and to become part of something else that I wasn't already part of. And as I continued growing up in my home, I realized that two of the 4 hated reading. And I couldn't understand that. I didn't understand why they hated reading and why they didn't want to get lost in the reading like I did. But again, God makes our brains all differently, and we all approach reading in a different way. So let's delve into reading for entertainment. We have to think about the same kinds of things. The source, is it going to be a magazine, a brochure, a novel, a poem? Again, we have to think about our reading style. Do you have the same reading style for reading to learn that you do for reading for entertainment? You might not. I usually don't. I read a lot on the exercise bike. I prefer to read for entertainment on the exercise bike. Because when I'm reading to learn, like when I'm studying my Sunday school lessons, I tend to slow down. And by the end, I'm so discouraged by the number of how many miles I rode versus if I'm reading for entertainment, I tend to ride faster. So it does depend on where you are and what you're doing and what you like as far as your reading style is concerned. And then what's the audience? Are you reading this for entertainment just for yourselves? Or are you reading it because you know you're going to be sharing in a book club, or you know you're going to be sharing with a friend? So depends as well. All right, so let's look at some other things. So after we have read for entertainment, and then what? What do we do with it? Do we close that book and go, wow, that was so good? Do we close that book and go, oh, I've got to share this with Susie. I can't wait to call her. Or do we say, oh, I can't wait for the book club next week that I'm going to be sharing this book with? Or do we close it and go, oh, I wasted my time. Why did I read this? Now, I am going to share with you something that's probably going to horrify you. And you're going to say, that is terrible, Teresa. What in the world? I have to read the end of the book first. I'm confessing. I can't help it because I get full of such anxiety as I'm reading for entertainment if I don't already know the end. But if I know the end, then I can go back and I can read and I'm relaxed and I can enjoy it. You know it's true. I always read the end of the book first, and I just can't help it. I have to do that because I need, and it's the same when the Olympics are on. You know how they say, hey, spoiler alert, or I have to know what the end result is before I can watch that competition in the Olympics because I'm too full of anxiety. So I have to confess, I do read the end of the book first. But sometimes we read at different levels depending on what we're going to do with it. Again, for entertainment, we might be reading it because we just want to enjoy, but we might be reading because we have to share or we want to share with others. But what happens when you read a book and you close that book and you say, oh, this is such a great story. I loved the ending. This was wonderful. And then that thing happens several months or several years later. What's that thing that happens? They make a movie. They make a movie. How dare they make a movie? A movie is created. So let's think about the book versus the movie thing. So, which one do you think is more thorough? A book or a movie? A book. A book is always more thorough because, for several reasons, a movie is limited by time. It can't be 4 or 5 hour movie, all right? But a book is not limited by time. A movie is limited by just the characters that you see that can speak to you. You can't normally in a movie, you can't get into their heads and you can't think about what's going on in those characters' heads like you can in a book because it explains it all to you and you're able to get in there and think about that. So typically books are deeper. The understanding of the characters and the understanding of the relationships are deeper than what you can get in a movie. So I'm going to talk about these movies and books. Now, all of these have been made into a movie. They were all started out as books. And I'm going to have to say that there is going to be a spoiler alert. We're going to talk about the ends of all of these. So if there's any that you haven't seen and you want to see, you might want to either go la, 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 or step outside. But I will confess, I'm not a moviegoer. I don't see many movies. I've seen some. I have not seen any of these movies. I've seen pieces of a couple, but I've never seen the whole thing of any of these movies. I also have to confess I'm a very avid reader, but I've only read one of these books. All right, can you guess which one? No, actually, The Scarlet Letter. The Scarlet Letter is the one that I've read. Okay, so we're going to talk about these, and it's okay if you don't agree with me. I got information from friends. I also got information from research that I did on movies versus books. So we're going to start with The Lord of the Rings, Return of the King. How many of you have read that book? How many of you have seen that movie? More people have seen the movie than have read the book. Okay, so the novel ends, as most of you know, or many of you know, that the hobbits return to the Shire, and they find it under attack, and that leads to the Shire Rebellion. But the movie is a lot more happily ever after. It doesn't end that way. There is no Shire Rebellion at the end of that movie. So it's different. How about The Scarlet Letter? How many of you have read that book? Me too. How many of you have seen that movie? Oh, more people have read the book than have seen the movie. Okay, all right. So with that particular book, the novel ends with the church minister, Arthur Dimmesdale, dying after he reveals to everyone that he's the father of Hester's daughter, Pearl. But the movie ends with a a war breaking out between the Algonquins and the Puritans, and Hester and Dimmesdale escape together. Isn't that how a movie should end? Much more fun. Okay, and then Forrest Gump. How many of you have read the book? Okay. Okay. How many of you have seen the movie? I knew that would be probably the biggest movie in here. Yes. So actually, the book and the movie end very, very differently. The book ends with Forrest living on the street with his old lieutenant, an orangutan named Sue. Kind of sad, don't you think? The movie ends with him marrying Jenny, and then Jenny does succumb to AIDS, but he raises the child that they have together. So it ends quite differently. All right, what about Where the Crawdads Sing? That's kind of new. The movie was out just a few months ago. How many of you have read the book? How many of you have seen the movie? Okay. Now, I got this information from some ladies at church who tried to encourage me to go to the movie to see this particular movie with them. I could not fit it in. I never had time. And when I found out it was a book, I said, oh no, I have to read the book first because I like to read the book before I see the movie. And so, but they said, oh, it won't matter because actually this book and this movie are very closely the same. They're very parallel to each other. Would you agree with that? Pretty much? Yeah, they're very, very closely to the same thing. So that's good to know with that particular one. And then the last one, The Martian, this is a very old, a very old book and a very old movie. Anybody read that book, The Martian? Oh, very good. All right, and what about the movie? Anybody seen it? All right, okay, and so again, the movie and the book are very closely related. They're not as starkly and drastically different as something like Forrest Gump. So sometimes they make movies be parallel, but most of the time the movies are not. They're a lot of times we'll see in the credits or at the beginning that it's an adaptation from the book, and they do that. Does that spoil your favorite book for you? Any of you hate when a movie comes out of your favorite book? No? Yeah. All right, so let's go on to the next one. Let's go to the third purpose of reading, to further your understanding of something and order to communicate it with others. So again, when we look at this particular area, we have to think about, are we listening to it or are we actively reading it? Are we going to be using a paper version or are we going to be looking at the screen? Is it one source or multiple sources? And then what's our learning style? And not only for this particular one, what's our learning style, because this could be an entertainment type reading, or it could be reading to learn because you're trying to understand something, okay? But, so do we need to take notes? Do we need to implement our note-taking strategy? And if we do, then which note-taking strategy are we going to use? What we have to decide is what works best for us. What works best for us and what are we going to get out of it? What's going to be the most proficient way for us to remember and to learn? So, where are we going to communicate this? Is this for a book club? Am I going to be writing an article about this? Am I going to be completing a blog? Am I the author of a blog and I'm going to write a blog about this? Or how about I'm going to share this through a team or Zoom online meeting? Is that the way this is going to be shared? So we think about those things because it's going to change the way we attack this particular purpose of reading. And then if we need clarifications like we talked before, where are we going to go to get them? Are we going to go to a friend? Are we going to go to a colleague? Are we going to go online? Where are we going to go to get those clarifications? And then thinking about the three purposes of reading: reading to learn, reading for entertainment, and reading to better understand something or communicate it with others. It doesn't matter the purpose, because comprehension is at the center of all of the purposes of reading. Comprehension is something that is critical for any type of reading and for us to get meaning out of and enjoy whatever it is that we're reading. So let's talk about comprehension for just a moment, because it is such a big part of reading. How can we improve our comprehension? Well, as John shared, what did Ben do? Read. You need to read. Read the work aloud. Discuss it in a book club or a reading group, because sometimes when we know we're going to have to discuss it with others, it helps us to tone in a little bit better on it and to really think about what we're reading and comprehend it a little bit better. And then we could follow along with a book on a tape. When I work with students who struggle with reading, I always recommend that they use audiobooks, always. But I am not a proponent for a person who struggles to just listen to the book and not ever open a page of that book. I want them to have that book open. I want them to be looking and following along as they're hearing it if they're a struggling reader, because it really helps them to focus in on several modalities of learning so that they can get the comprehension part of that book. And then am I going to use a note-taking strategy to help me with comprehension? Usually if you take notes, you're going to understand it better and you're going to remember things better. In the year 1999, the national government decided that reading across America was not good. And they wanted to formulate a national reading panel to help us come up with a better structure of literacy for everyone in America to improve our literacy and reading scores. So this national reading panel did quite a bit of research, and they came up with the National Reading Report. If any of you are, you probably aren't if you're not an educator, but anyway, they released the National Reading Report in the year 2000. And in that National Reading Report, they came up with the 5 pillars of literacy. And if you notice, one of those pillars is comprehension. It is an extremely important part of reading. This was trying to solve the debate of phonics versus whole language that was happening in a lot of the school systems in America, and what students really needed to become a good reader. And so that's why the National Reading Panel released this 5 pillars of literacy for America. Now, 1 year later, in 2001, Hollis Scarborough, who was a senior scientist at Haskins Laboratories, decided that he wanted to conceptualize the reading rope. How many of you have ever heard of the reading rope? Okay, if you're not an educator, that's okay. But what we know is that a rope gets its strength from all of the strands that are woven together. And that's the illustration I'm going to show you about the reading rope. There are 2 areas, language comprehension and word recognition. And the strands of language comprehension are woven together. And then the strands of word recognition are woven together. And we come up with Scarborough's reading rope that's woven together with both of those areas that makes it very strong. So that makes you become a very skilled reader, increasingly strategic from the language comprehension side, and then word recognition, which leads to increasingly automatic. So this is the reading rope. It only came out a year later, and I will tell you that in the world of education today, you will hear more about the reading rope than you do about the 5 pillars of literacy. I think that they both have their purpose. I think that they both help us to understand literacy and reading. And so I don't think that pardon me, my allergies are killing me today because of the change in the weather, but I don't think it's a detriment to have either one or to look at either one, because I think they both have their purpose. So what are the benefits of reading? Well, have you ever heard reading is writing is reading is writing is reading is writing? Have you heard that? When you read, you become a better writer. When you write, you become a better reader. And through all of that, you expand your vocabulary, as Dr. Ben Carson talked about in his book, or not in his book, but in the speech that he gave, or that piece of his book, that he was able to expand his vocabulary through the wide reading that he was doing. They're all intertwined and interwoven together. It's very hard to separate them because they do all support each other and go so well together. And then what are the 5 benefits of reading? I mean, what do we do? What do we get out of it? Looking at research by Kim Tu of Junior Learning, there are 5 benefits that we look at. Reducing stress, helping us to relax, improving our concentration and our memory, expanding our vocabulary and our writing like I just talked about, enhancing our knowledge, and increasing our imagination and our creativity. Those are all great benefits of reading. But what if I'm not a good reader? Is it really going to relax me and reduce my stress? No. It's going to increase my stress, and it's going to make me be more uptight and more anxious. One of the reasons I read the end of the book first, so that I'm not so stressed out. Because for some people, it's difficult to read. It's difficult to write. And what can we do about that? Let's talk about a few things we can do. But before we do that, let's think about what happens to our mind when we read. Research has shown that the act of listening to a story can light up our brains. When we're told a story, story time. Did you hate it when you got too old for story time? But when we listen to a story, our language processing parts of our brain are activated, and the experimental parts as well. So audiobooks are great. They're wonderful for reading. But listening to narratives all day long are great too. So go ahead. Lean over, listen into your coworker's story about how they went on and on about that vacation they went on, or about whatever, because it's great. Our brains really light up. Tune into talk radio. I know my husband listens to talk radio a lot, and that engages the brain. And then maybe you want to listen to an audiobook in the car if you're driving a long way. That's a great way to keep your brain activated. I love music, and we travel occasionally. And when we travel, I enjoy listening to music. But if I want to stay awake, I need to listen to an audiobook, because that keeps my brain engaged, whereas just listening to music for me does not keep my brain engaged. It's a great way to keep your brain engaged. So any kind of reading provides stimulation for your brain. But different types of reading will give different experiences. Looking at research from Stanford University, they found that pleasure reading increases the blood flow to the brain. And when they looked at that, they know that if you simply pleasure read, that's great for your brain. It's going to exercise your brain. But if you are reading for pleasure, but you're intently studying that literacy because you know you're going to have to share it, or you're wanting to learn something from it, that's when it really exercises your brain. And not everyone is a natural reader, unfortunately. Poor readers may not truly understand the joy of literature. Poor readers don't get to have the experiences that I had, to go on all these travels and to be in different places and put yourself into different families and that kind of thing that reading brings. And so we can train people to be better readers. And in the training, we can actually change their brain. Now, when I was growing up, unfortunately, we were told that your IQ was your IQ. Whatever you had, that's what you got, and you couldn't change it. That's a shame. That's not true. Our brains are muscles. They're malleable. You can change them, and you can strengthen them. And I've done it with kids, and so I want to share a little bit about that with you. Remember what I told you about these areas of the brain that are part of reading? A good reader, a successful reader, uses that left hemisphere, and they use these different areas to engage in that process of reading. So what happens when poor readers struggle? What happens to the brain, and what can we do about it? Most people who struggle with reading have something called dyslexia. And dyslexia looks different for different people. It's not going to look the same for everybody. All right? So sometimes people see words on the page that wave. It's wavy. Some dyslexic people see text that's upside down. Some see nonsense, like a foreign language, because the letters are all different and they're not the same. They're all jumbled up. All right. Some people can use things like colored overlays to help them. Typically, the students who see them wavy, a colored overlay will make them lay down and behave themselves so that they can read successfully. We've had a lot of success with that, especially a blue overlay. It just depends on the student and or the adult and what works for them. But what I want you to know is that the brain of a dyslexic person, they use the right side. Isn't that amazing? Dyslexic students or adults are using the right side of their brain to read instead of the left side. Where are all the pieces that help us read? They're on the left side. So it's very difficult for a dyslexic person to read and comprehend because they do not have the brain working in the way that people who are successful readers do. And so they are really having trouble with underactivating, especially the angular gyrus and the temporal lobe. Those are the two areas that are underactivated with dyslexic adults or children who are struggling to read. So let's look at a non-dyslexic brain versus a dyslexic brain. As you can see, on the left side of a dyslexic brain, those two areas are not activated. And so students or adults, they struggle. Dyslexia is a language problem where the brain develops differently. You notice I didn't say wrong. I didn't say underdevelops. I said it develops differently. Because what did I tell you at the beginning? God created each of us in His own image, and He created our brains. So dyslexic students can be very successful. It's just that their brains are developed differently. It makes it hard for the occipital and temporal cortex to integrate and to understand words, and therefore those portions are underactivated. And so it makes it very hard to read and to comprehend. The occipital temporal cortex, and remember I told you that was way at the back of that temporal cortex. It's the area that stores images and meaning of information, sight words. People with dyslexia have a very difficult time learning sight words. They have a very difficult time with that. And then because the angular gyrus is not activated either, remember that angular gyrus is what puts it all together, so we can take C-A-T to act to cat, and it's not activated for dyslexic students. So, how do you think it would feel to be someone with dyslexia? Frustrating. Not easy. We hear them say, I'm dumb. I can't get this. And they're not. I just retired from a program at a private school. It was a private Christian school, pretty large private Christian school, where I worked with students exclusively who had dyslexia and ADHD. And I heard them say, I can't do this. I'm dumb. And I said, you can do this. You're smart. The average IQ in our program was 120. They're not stupid. They're not dumb. They're very smart. God gave them great talents. They just learn differently. And once I was able to get them to understand that they learn differently and that's okay, their confidence shot way up. And they were able to attack this and look at this and learn differently. I will tell you that when I first started the program, I thought it was hokey. I thought I have a doctorate. I've never heard of this. What in the world? But I saw it work. I saw it work time and time again. I'm still working with one of the students privately. This is my 7th year with this student, and he's come so far. He knows what to do to help him, and he's quite successful in high school now. So we can work with these children and adults even who have difficulty with reading. So I want you to try this out. Now, this is going to be a type of dyslexia. I told you there are different types of dyslexia, different degrees, different levels. But we're going to use this one for the purpose of today. And I want you to read this and tell me what you're reading after you've done it. How's your comprehension going?
It's about the effect of DNA sequences on your brain.
Yep. Difficult? Did you get it? I see a lot of furrowed brows. Are you having difficulty? What if I give you a cheat sheet? Will that help? You think? All right, so Morris, if you don't mind passing out this sheet, I'm going to give you a little cheat sheet. Here's what you're going to see on your cheat sheet. So when you see the letters on the left, you're going to pronounce them as the letters on the right. So now I want you to give it a go after you get your sheet. Give it a go and give it a try and see if you can now understand the passage with our cheat sheet once you get it. I'll give you a little bit of time. Boy, I see some concentration happening in this room. Are you doing better? Is it taking much longer? Trying to interpret? You want me to give you a few more minutes? All right. I'm sorry?
It's like decoding.
It is like decoding, isn't it? Okay, so how did it make you feel? Frustrated? I heard dumb. Yes. Could you feel the frustration of figuring out the words? Does it let you glimpse just a little bit into the life of someone who has dyslexia? It's difficult. How is your reading comprehension? No? Okay. I know for me, when I first did this, I was trying so hard to figure the words out that I couldn't remember what I just read, much less getting it right. How eager were you to read after this? Did you really want to go back with the cheat sheet and try it? Yeah. And I know that I'm an avid reader, but I was so frustrated that I thought, I just need to quit. This isn't worth it. So now you know how adults and children who have dyslexia face text every day, all the time. It's very, very frustrating. And not only do they struggle with reading, but they struggle with handwriting, they struggle with spelling and memory, also expressing themselves successfully. They have a very slow processing speed. And the reason it's slow is not because they're not smart, it's because they're having to try to figure out what these letters are standing for. So it's taking them a long time to process that. And then it's very difficult for them to follow directions as well because of these problems. And so it's difficult. It's just difficult. What do they need? What do we need to do to help them? Well, adults and children alike need all of these things. When handwriting is difficult, why can't they use a word processor with spell check? Because we're not really testing them on or trying to see if they can read or write. We're trying to see if they understand the content, right? Okay? And so, dyslexics have an advantage when we give them audiobooks or ebooks so that they can take the part away where they struggle with the letters and just comprehend good, pure enjoyment of literature. They don't get that all the time, and so let's let them do that, all right? And remember what I told you about how good readers use the left side of their brain. Dyslexics use the right side of their brain. So what can we do about that? There are things we can do. Believe it or not, there are things we can do. And let's talk about that. We need to strengthen both sides of their brain. So, let me keep going here. Oh, sorry, I thought I had already done those. I apologize. So, our brains have a midline. And we can use exercises that help to strengthen both sides of the brain so that dyslexic students or adults can work on strengthening that left side so they can become better readers. It really does work. I've worked with students using these exercises and it helps them to be more successful. It does not happen overnight. Let me repeat that. It does not happen overnight. It is a long, lengthy process, and a lot of the research that comes from exercising both sides of the brain actually was developed by a nurse who was working with stroke patients and trying to help those stroke patients recover one side or the other of their brain. And so these exercises were born and it kind of morphed and developed into areas of education where we work with dyslexic students and or adults. So this is not the purpose of my being here today for me to get into and delve into all of the exercises that we use, but we do use quite a bit. One of the most popular and one of the ones that you might have read something about are figure eights. Does that sound familiar to anyone? So figure eights, and not only just figure eights, but figure eights on a chalkboard. Yes, I know, it's archaic, but the chalkboard is very tactile. A whiteboard is not. You cannot feel the resistance from a whiteboard, but you can feel the resistance from a chalkboard. And so if you use a figure eight that is shoulder to shoulder, forehead to waist, it forces people to cross that midline back and forth and back and forth. And you're doing some exercises. Not only are you drawing figure eights, but you're verbally saying the direction you're going. And on top of that, you're having math problems thrown at you, and you're having to solve them orally. So it's really working that brain, and I will tell you, as I work with people through this exercise, by the time we're done, their brain is very tired, but it's very good. It really works both sides of that brain, and I could go on and on, but that's not the purpose of today. I just wanted to mention it to you, that we do work with students and adults on overcoming and helping them to learn differently and successfully with dyslexia. One of the places you can go to read more if you're interested is NILD.org. That's the National Institute for Learning Development. The people who are trained under that organization are called educational therapists. I am one, and I have been performing educational therapy for 7 years now. And then most of what needs to happen with dyslexic children or adults also needs to be Orton-Gillingham based. Those are the pieces that are missing for dyslexic students or adults, and it helps them to fill in those gaps. And then also, I don't know about in the Austin area so much, maybe others might know, but NIHouse is huge in the Houston area. And it's a very successful intervention program that works with people with dyslexia. And all of these, you do have to go through a very intensive training program to be a certified therapist in those areas. I just wanted to mention that there are some successful strategies and things that we can do to strengthen that brain and to change what's going on. All right, so let's go back to our love-hate relationship. You notice I capitalized love because I love to read. So maybe I've given you some insight today on why some people say they love reading and why some people say, I hate reading. We looked at 3 purposes: reading to learn, reading for entertainment, and reading to understand something and order to communicate it with others. And reading can, believe it or not, be very enjoyable and very fun. I do have references for you. If you want them, I'll be happy to send them to you. I have a lot. But I hope you enjoyed today, and I hope you just got a little bit of a glimpse from what the 3 purposes of reading are, how our brains work, and how they're developed, and how good readers use the left side, dyslexic readers use the right side, and what we can do to exercise that. So thank you very much for letting me come and speak to you today.
So talking about Dr. Ben Carson and how his mother
made him read 2 books a week and write him papers.
Yes.
In his biography, he notes that at the time, he did not know she was illiterate. She was not able to read a single paper that he
But
wrote.
she knew.
She knew that that was the avenue to success because she cleaned houses for a living. And one of the things that she noticed about all these successful houses is they all had a library. They all were staffed
Books.
with books. So the importance of reading when you have 2 sisters who don't like to read, or you have students who don't like to read, how do you instill that love of
Yes.
reading?
Great question. One of the things that we do, because I do face a lot of people who say they hate to read, especially with younger people, students, we focus on trying to find what they enjoy. So if they're a student who loves motorcycles, what kind of literature do you think I'm going to find for them? I'm going to find as much literature as I can about motorcycles, both fiction and nonfiction. What's the Mouse and the Motorcycle is one story I can think of, you librarians out there. And but there's a lot of nonfiction stories about motorcycles as well. Something else that has really helped high school students to enjoy literature, especially if they have to read something like Romeo and Juliet, are graphic novels. I don't know if you know anything about graphic novels, but graphic novels are written in a way that are like cartoons. Yet, and they're written more progressive in today's times and language. And so it helps them to really tune in and hone in. So we're constantly working to find things they're interested in, to get them to read, and then to get them to have audiobooks or ebooks so that they are listening to what is being read in that text to help them to begin to love that learning and that reading.
Okay, I'm going to ask that question. I'm left-handed, as is 10% of the population, so are my reading centers still on the left hemisphere?
Yes, your reading is still on the left side of the hemisphere. And when we work with students who have dyslexia, and believe it or not, in our program, I would say 1 out of every 5 were left-handed, which was very interesting. I would love to do some research on that. But anyway, we still work with the same program. They're still doing the same, crossing that midline back and forth. It's just a little bit more difficult for them as they work with that left-handedness. Yes?
You were talking about dyslexia.
Uh-huh.
And the code, the D can be
Right.
Q.
Right.
Does that code vary among
Yes.
dyslexic?
It does.
people?
It does, but for the most part, overall, D's, B's, and Q's are all seen the same, or they all flip. And the same with some of the other things that you saw on that sheet. But for the most part, they all see it kind of like that, but there are variations. And like I told you, there are variations of dyslexia where they might see it wavy or upside down instead of right side up.
Numbers too.
And numbers too, yes, numbers too. Mm-hmm.
So first of all, thank you very much. And a challenge and a question. So I would challenge that all reading is educational, even the narrative.
That's
because
right.
we're learning about the human condition.
Yes.
And my question is, how do you encourage people to develop vocabulary? For example, I was just reading Johann von Goethe's book on the theory of light.
Mm-hmm.
I was having to look up every other sentence. He was contemporary to Newton. And I realized how much vocabulary we have lost in just a few hundred years.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at business writing courses, everything is short declarative sentences, limited vocabulary. How do you encourage people to develop that when all society says, no, simple words, simple sentences?
Right. It's really difficult to do that with adults, but I can tell you with students, it's much more, we have much more of an open area to do that with students because as we work with their writing, we'll tell them, after, as an editor, I'll say, can you think of a different word that you could use in this for this? And we use, with my students, we use a whole lot of Google so that we're looking up different, and we use a whole lot of searching for synonyms so that we're using different vocabulary that would be more powerful. We call it the powerful words. And so we're always looking for strengthening their writing through looking for different vocabulary. It really helps. And then reading widely. If you read widely, you're going to read a variety of vocabulary. It is a harder thing to do. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think when we're children, we learn how to read orally.
Mhm.
So there's this internal voice, that
Yes.
oral voice that slows down the reading process.
Mhm.
But my question relates to visual reading. Is visual reading a real thing? You know, I've seen videos where people can scan a whole page and understand everything, and I guess the brain can put all those words together
Right.
for them, and they can comprehend it all.
Mhm.
Or a line at a time visually, the brain could do that, put it all together so you can understand it.
Mhm.
Is there a way to learn? Is visual reading a real thing?
Yes, it's a real thing. People do. There are some people who have the reading ability to scan a page and it sticks in their minds. Not a lot of people can do that, but some can do that. So, but really, visual reading, reading is reading is reading is reading. It all goes together. So we're all visual readers in one degree or another because we're all seeing that print on that page. But for some, they're more successful at visual reading. Like I am a great scanner. It amazes my students when I work with them. If they're given, okay, I'm telling on myself here. If they're given a text that they have to complete 30 questions on for homework, then I help them out and I scan it. I'm a really good scanning reader. And then they have to answer the questions, but I'm able to help them through showing them in the work where the answers are or what the answers are based on if it's inferencing, because I can scan through it instead of having to laboriously go through the whole thing. So there is something to visual reading.
And you can learn that through practice.
There are actually courses you can take on speed reading. You can take courses, there are courses everywhere offered on speed reading. I've never taken one, I don't know what's involved in one, but I know you can take courses on speed reading. But I just am a natural scanner, I can do that, and it just helps. You know, it just doesn't help me when I'm trying to learn something and I really need to synthesize everything, but it certainly helps when I need an overview.
Thank you for your as a teenager, I had a left brain injury, and so I find reading very frustrating and comprehension very low. Is there anything you would suggest other than taking notes?
Keep reading. Read, read, read. And write. Go back to the old-fashioned writing. You know, so much of the time we are texting or we're Facebook messaging, and it's all short and curt. Go back to writing snail mail. Go back to writing letters. Find a pen pal, because that helps so much with growing your reading and your vocabulary and also growing your fluency. But read, read, read. And listen to reading as you follow along. That will help a lot as well.
I have a friend, and she can read because I've heard her read, but she stumbles over the words. And she said she does exactly what you said. She says, "Oh, I'm done. I just can't do this." And a lot of times in Bible study, she won't even get half of it done because she gets frustrated.
Right.
And I'm just wondering, is there any way, anything I could tell her that would help her to
Audiobooks, even an audio version of the Bible, so that instead of having to try to absorb all this time in her trying to figure the words out, then she would be able to go right to the Bible study part because she's hearing the text instead of having to laboriously try to read that text. I would definitely suggest an audio version of her Bible for her and for that book study or that Bible study.
or just an audio book in general, something like romance, she likes that kind of stuff.
Yes, any of that. Yes, ma'am.
Over here?
Over here.
Okay, is there a relationship between photographic reading or memory and photographic reading, I guess, of these sort of, is there some connection or correlation to that?
That's a great question, and I'm sorry I do not know the answer to that. I would assume that there is a correlation between that because of if you have a photographic memory, I'm sure it will help you with photographic reading as well and with whatever it is that you're doing. But I'm sorry I don't really know a lot about that area.
First, you were great.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, so when you talk about you read the end of the book first, if I'm reading a book about a dog, is the end of the book the last chapter for you? Because I find myself, okay, I read the last chapter, and then and he's
Right.
gone, then I'm going back,
Uh-huh.
trying to find out, oh, when did the dog die?
Yes.
And if I think he's gonna die, then I don't wanna read the rest of the book.
So that happens to me. I'll read the last few pages to see if I can get the essence of the ending. If that doesn't work, I'll back up a little further. And then I'll try to get the essence of the ending. And if that doesn't work, then I'll start my scanning process of trying to scan to find the end or to find what I'm looking for. But yes, sometimes you have to go a little further back. You end up reading the book backwards.
As a student and expert in reading, we do appreciate your presentation, Victor. Is there an author that, among authors, that you particularly enjoy, that you recommend, that just crafts a great story and a great sentence? And is there somebody that you tune into particularly?
Thurman Murphy. He's one of my favorite authors. He's written quite a few things, and I've enjoyed his reading. But besides Thurman Murphy, I couldn't really recommend one because I enjoy so many. I really enjoy Christian fiction. That's really my genre that I go to. I love literature and I love reading, but it bothers me personally. It might not bother others, but I get really hung up on, and it ruins it for me if there's so much cursing in a novel or scenes that I wish were not there. And so I really focus more on Christian fiction, and there's not that many authors, unfortunately, in Christian fiction, but there are several that I read and enjoy in Christian fiction.
Can you name one you enjoy?
Oh gosh. No. No, I'm sorry. I'll think about it.
Okay, right here.
Oh, not supposed to tell a story, but I'm glad it started with Ben Carson. And because my dad saw us sitting around the TV back when it was black and white, and he had to replace tubes. And he just said, this isn't natural, and he died. He didn't fix it for 4 years until a relative saved us by giving us the TV. So, I mean, anything lying around, we had to read. So that would be for a person that would normally be a good reader, I think, is to do that, for sure. I mean, I'm not normal because, like, little kids on the playground would say, he uses big words. And then I would try to say ain't and short words, but actually what they hated was I used long sentences, like this one, you know. And so I was already a good reader, but Bible studies, my question is, I see that the guys at a men's Bible study that just struggle to read, and it's embarrassing for a guy to do that, they also have memorized considerably more scripture than I have. So I don't think it's necessarily a downside. And then I was wondering how would they address that instead of saying words wrong in front of a bunch of people? Would they read out loud to themselves, or is there a phone app where you had to read back to the? Because I had a language learning app where I had to read back Spanish to the phone, and I wonder if there's something.
Yes. And you know, I forgot to mention that when I was talking about note taking. Some people do actually like to take their notes in an audio form. They record them either on their phone or on a device so that they can listen to the notes later. But it's the same with that. Yes. There are a lot of people that might record themselves reading so that they can play it back and hear themselves and help themselves to improve in certain areas. And it's also good for them to just listen to the text again. Up here? Oh, right here.
Another question. So, and I feel like this answer, there's an app called Otter that you can read into your phone, and it will transcribe it and keep the audio. So I have seen several studies on comprehension and retention of screen versus paper. My curiosity question is, in the educational arena, where they've shown, and the numbers vary between, say, 15 and, say, 35% less comprehension on digital reading, why the educational industry seems to be focusing more and more on digital reading?
Great question. And I can tell you that for me personally, I comprehend much better on paper form than I do on screen. My current job, I work for Western Governors University. I'm an evaluator, and I work 20 hours a week, 100% online, reading and scoring work for master's level students. And I struggle with it because I can't make notes. I can't, for me, the screen, I begin to get blurry. I'm having to look away. I'm having to reread, whereas I don't have to do that on paper. So yes, I understand the frustration. I think the reason, and this is just the TeressaVoltz version, of why so many educational institutions today focus on online learning versus paper learning, money. It costs a lot less to give a student or a group of students an online assignment than it does for them to have to print it out on paper. It's also environmentally more friendly in our worlds today. So
the college textbooks cost exactly the same amount.
Yes, they do. Yes, I know. I understand. Yes.
Hi, I wanted to just share a resource
Great.
on this topic.
Very good.
There's actually an organization here in town called Learning Ally.
Yes.
It used to be called Recording for the Blind and
Yes.
Dyslexic.
Yes.
And I was a volunteer there for a while, and I would read the books and record myself reading books, and they
Great.
had a whole bunch of people doing that. So
Yes.
that's their thing, is creating those audio recordings to help students that are learning challenged.
Yes. Thank you for saying that. I actually, when I was at the school level, I would record novels that the high school was reading or middle school, and I would become the audiobook. But I learned about Learning Ally, learningally.com, and actually if a student has been officially diagnosed with dyslexia or a learning disability in reading, Learning Ally will cover the cost of that for free if they turn in their documentation. So it's a great resource for parents.
Do you think that it's possible for a child with dyslexia, some type of learning disability, that gets the help they need year after year as they go through school, will they ever become a fluent reader or even a pretty good reader?
They will, but they will learn differently. They will always learn differently. They just have to figure out what works for them. So they might not be a fluent reader like me, but they will become a very competent reader, either through audiobooks or through the practicing of what they're doing. The student that I'm working with, this is his 7th year, he reads very successfully now out loud, whereas before he could not at all. But he is not as fast as some of his peers, but that's okay. He's getting it. And he knows that audiobooks are his friend, and he also knows that word processing and spell check is his friend. He is a wonderful writer. His writing changed when he figured out that he could use the word processor and teachers would let him with spell check versus trying to handwrite his essays. His writing is very full, but he never showed that until he started using that.
Okay, so along the same lines, for people with dyslexia, they have trouble reading print. I imagine they really struggle with cursive writing, and is that part of the reason why schools don't teach cursive?
Oh, I could talk to you a whole day about cursive writing. There is so much research that supports cursive writing in the brain, and especially for dyslexic students. Part of that therapy that we do, crossing that midline, involves cursive writing. Our kids that are in our program become beautiful cursive writers because we use it. I mean, they think they're just improving their cursive writing. We're actually doing therapy on both sides of their brain. We use it on a chalkboard again, where they start over here, and they're called motifs, and they practice the strokes of cursive writing with sayings, so that they're crossing that midline, but they're also strengthening that cursive writing. There's a lot of research about cursive writing in the brain. It's really good for the brain.